attended by several of the leagues, clashed with the police at the Place de la Concorde, leaving 15 dead and 1,435 people wounded. At one point, the crowd headed toward the bridge leading over the Seine to the Chamber of Deputies, France's lower house of parliament. Although evidence is contradictory as to whether the demonstrators actually planned to storm the chamber and overthrow the Republic at that moment, the events galvanized center and left-wing political opinion. And this really triggered the Popular Front. A week later, the CGT, the large trade union organization in France, had called a demonstration in Paris, attended by 1 million people. There were parallel demonstrations in Lyon, and pretty soon the Popular Front started to develop on the basis of an alliance, a political alliance that becomes an electoral alliance between the Communist Party, the Socialist Party, and the middle class party, the Radical Party. Now, what's really interesting about this is as the Communist Party swung into this alliance, leaving behind its policy of the Third Front, which had said that alliances with the socialists should be avoided because they're basically social fascists. As they did this, many metal workers joined them, and their participation in these organizations and the mass mobilizations of the power of the Popular Front indicate that they had swung over to many of the positions that the reformist political currents and identity, particularly questions about electoral politics, alliances, and the nation were concerned. So how do I explain this? Well, this is the long fruit of the changes in political opportunity structure and industrial social relations. The Popular Front serves to this day as a standard for measuring the ampler, the breadth and depth of popular political mobilizations. So at this point, I thought I would maybe kind of link it with some of the current events happening in France. The recent social and labor mobilizations against the Sarkozy government's plans in France to raise the retirement age draw our attention back to the 1936 Popular Front because state-funded retirement plans began, as it did here in the US, in the context of the Popular Front. Every time there is a mass protest involving students and workers, another big moment in French political struggle, May 68, is invoked. Less frequently, May 68 is compared with the May-June 1936 strikes. Since the 1936 events are part of my book's analysis, I thought I'd say then a few words trying to link 36, 68, and now 2010. Well, consider the numbers involved in the strikes. In 1936, in the May-June strikes, there were 2.6 million workers on strike, which was the largest strike wave France had ever experienced up to that point. In 1968, 7 million workers were on strike. There are sometimes the figure of 10 million is passed around, but it was probably more. Historians today agree that it was probably about 7 million people on strike, which is certainly an incredibly massive social protest. The demonstrations we've seen this fall in France have involved up to 3.5 million workers in 8 different national days of mobilization. Just a couple of more comparisons and contrasts. If we look back to the 1936 strike wave, we see that the strikes were basically against employers in the private sector. And though the government, the Popular Front government, headed by Socialist Prime Minister Léon Blum, had come to power a few weeks before in May. So the strikers in 1936, in May, June 1936, in Paris and Lyon and throughout the country, were in fact expecting the support of what they considered and had reason to expect would have been a friendly government. As it happens, the contradictions of the Popular Front is serving two masters, the middle class, smaller employers involved with the Radical Party, and strong defenders of private property, and the labor organizations, the communists and socialists on the other. That put the Blum government, as all Popular Front governments find themselves in, into a real bind. So they tried to satisfy both ends, with the result no one was happy, and the government falls after about 11 months, comes back briefly for a few weeks, and then the Popular Front is over by 1938, 1939. What about 1968? Who were those strikes against? Well, the strikes were mostly private sector strikes, but there was a general movement behind that in opposition to the policies of the de Gaulle government. The Grenelle agreements that came out of the May 68 resulted in big wage hikes, but the elections resulted in a right-wing government, the government of George Pompidou, perhaps one of the big ironies of May 68. Well, in this round, the government, of course, is a very strong, authoritarian, right-wing government, the government around President Nicolas Sarkozy. There's been 8 days of massive mobilizations. The government apparently is not backing down. If you read the newspapers, you might think that the movement's over because the law raising the retirement age from 65 to 67 for most workers has been signed into law, but don't ask French strikers, don't ask French unions, don't ask the 70% of the French population that opposes the Sarkozy plans. So it's really not over here. And as those workers and their allies seek to the path of continuing their struggle to defend the social gains of the Popular Front and the general social gains that were also registered after World War II, they look back to May 68, and they also look back to 1936, the experience of the Popular Fronts, and they encounter some of the issues that I attempt to raise and discuss in the book. So I thought maybe after having laid all this out, maybe I'll pause here and we can move to questions and discussion.
Is on?
Yeah.
So, thanks, Keith. That was really good. I have a couple of questions related to the labor process in the early part of the century. One is on technological determinism. That is the amount of automation, the reaction to de-skilling. Were these union movements defensive? Were they offensive? What was the role of Taylorism? I talked a little bit about that. And how did it impact the labor process in those early years? And how did it help shape their consciousness, their identities? The second one is about gender. I'm wondering how you conceive gender as part of the labor process, sort of the hierarchy of gender and class in the 1930s. I'm assuming silk workers were women. I don't know. Were they protective of occupational segregation? Did they did they reject it in favor of wage equity and occupational equity? And which brings up the larger question, I think, of the gender critique of Braverman and where does women's labor, the role of women's labor in the development of labor process in that schema. So.
Okay. Well, those are really big questions that I take up in the book, and I do document a lot of the labor process. In the years right before the book starts, French workers were usually either unskilled workers or very highly skilled workers, and this was because it has a lot to do with the rhythm of industrial development and class formation in France, which I won't go into now here, but this posed a real problem for French employers in terms of control over the labor process and ultimately production and profits. French metalworking shops were really run by the workers. The rhythm of work, the amount of output were really controlled by the workers. And they were able to do this because of their control over the labor process that was rooted in their skill, their possession of scarce